three different streams going on, so you get a wide variety of FinCrime professionals in different roles. So as a tech provider, that covers a big basis. And I think as a provider, you really understand the people that we want to have conversations with.
Every year they have all new topics coming in. It is not a repetitive thing which I have seen year on year. Always a diversified line of speakers, and always the subjects are just absolutely outstanding.
So yeah, welcome Richard to Richard Bromley. We have today with us, who is Director and Head of Fraud and Disputes at Monzo. So we're going to chat today a little bit about yourself and hear what you're up to. So perhaps we could just kick off a little bit about what your core focus currently is at Monzo and your areas, I guess, of expertise, and what keeps you up at night or focusing on fraud and financial crime, really.
Absolutely. What a place for us to start. I could probably be here for the hour. I guess I'll probably start by indexing on what keeps me up at night. And I think this is the scale of fraud that we're seeing in the UK. So fraud is now considered to be a UK national security threat. So that's a hell of a statement. But when we think about it, fraud has a real direct impact on economic growth. I believe it costs the economy an estimated £190 billion per year. Leaning in a bit closer, it's now the most commonly reported crime in the UK, accounting for 41% of all reported crime, even though we know 70% of it originates overseas, kind of adding that global context to it. But we also know it very much victimizes or targets the potentially the most vulnerable, and really disproportionately affects those who are potentially on lower incomes in more challenging circumstances. And we know that people who are affected by fraud also suffer wider negative impacts. So impacts on their mental, physical health, potentially push them into debt. And we know it's very much in financial services an industry issue. UK Finance reported around 1.17 billion was reported in terms of fraud losses last year alone. Those statistics in of themselves are what keep me up at night. And I think the challenge that we have in front of us as an industry, I think from a Monzo perspective, the way we think about our customers is we want to make money work for everyone. And when we think about fraud overlaying that, we can only really get there by driving really high customer safety and security. And we do that through cutting edge fraud protection, machine learning models, rule sets, interventions, but also creating features which we hope that our customers will use and apply. So for example, the Monzo call status feature, which allows people to check, actually, am I on the phone with Monzo, if they potentially might be in the midst of a potential impersonation scam. But I think the last thing I'd finish on in it, I think this is important because it's very much how we think about things at Monzo with the customer at the center, is the impact of fraud isn't just that financial impact. It is that impact on a person's well-being, which really is unquantifiable. And we also know that fraud is really underreported. I think I saw a stat quite recently where I think only 1 in 6 report fraud. That is, again, a hell of a statistic, right? Because if you think about people who aren't reporting fraud, for whatever reason that might be potential embarrassment, that might be the potential stigma associated to fraud, which we need to break. But by proxy of somebody not reporting fraud, it means that we as a bank miss that opportunity to protect them and have their back and really make sure we can support them through that particular situation, but also to actually go after the fraudsters themselves and to understand actually where the money is moving around the financial ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, some of those numbers, the statistics you've mentioned are obviously staggering, aren't they? Quite mind-boggling. So I think you have touched on this a little bit, but in terms of making money work for everyone, then how do you actually build trust in financial services for customers? Then, what's your take on that?
It's a really good question. We actually did a survey and a campaign not too long ago around Monzo and around banking. And I think the really interesting thing was, at least for me, because all of my career has been in banking and financial services, is a word that people associate with Monzo, which is love. It's very, very rare you hear a customer say, I love my bank. That is rare, but it's something we take incredibly seriously. And that love is there around fraud. It's there around making sure we can protect our customers. And the way I think about fraud is really probably in 3 different components. So I think about fraud protection or fraud prevention outside of the moment. So by which I mean where a customer hasn't yet been affected by fraud. So here our focus is really around customer empowerment. And the way we think about this is through the development of actual tangible tools which our customers can use to protect themselves. And I think more crucially, know when to utilize them or when to go and adopt them. So obviously I mentioned the call status tool we created last week, a couple of years ago. From a customer's perspective, knowing that they can actually come into the Monzo app, go into their security settings, security profile, and see some of these tangible tools gives them that feeling of empowerment and control, and that feeling hopefully they can say no. Obviously, we can come then into the moment. So where there is, this is where our systems have potentially detected transactional or behavioral activity, which is indicative that something isn't quite right, allowing us to take those steps in real time to intervene and speak to our customer before they actually make a payment, which we think potentially could be fraudulent. This is where our superpower comes in, because whilst we have fantastic technology, it is our fraud investigators who are the key to intervening, supporting our customers and helping to prevent fraud from happening very much in that moment, because we know, especially with a number of typologies of APP fraud, it's a real adversarial battle. The fraudster is already engaged in communication with the customer. That could be a phone call, that could be the creation of a friendship, a romantic relationship. That level of trust has already been created by the criminal. So from a banking perspective, we need to make sure we're doing the right things to actually ensure we can get the customer to tell us a bit more about what the payment might be for, and for us to ultimately to protect that. And the final component is around aftercare, because as we've mentioned, fraud is very much an industry issue. So we know where it does happen, we need to be there for our customers and be there to have their back. From our perspective, the way we think about this is making sure that customers can report and leverage our 24/7 in-app reporting service to get through to us as quickly as possible, because we know fraud never sleeps, right? So if you are concerned that something might have happened at 2 o'clock in the morning, we want to make sure you're able to get through to us as quickly as possible. And that's where, again, our really highly trained fraud team is there to respond with empathy and with urgency, because these moments are horrendous. I'm unfortunate enough to have been affected by fraud. Luckily, it was many years ago. The bank who I was with at the time were fantastic and treated me as a human being in a very difficult situation. And that's a trick to this. Like, whilst fraud levels, as we've mentioned, are really high, there are humans in the midst of this, and that's why we need to make sure we are supporting any customer who goes for any of those components.
Absolutely, yeah. My teenage daughter also went through that experience as well. So yeah, you can see how traumatizing that can be. So but it was also a few lessons learned as well. So yeah, the other thing everyone talks about now is fraud is becoming a business. So again, we might have touched on some of these points already, but how do we face that fact that it now is a business, big business, and what challenges and pressure points, I guess, are we up against as you see it?
Look, you're absolutely right. It is a business. It really is a business now. So there are scam centers operating all over the world. They are localized to a few certain regions, but essentially these scam centers have been set up as businesses. They have KPIs, they're expecting return on investment, and they have professionalized what they do, basically utilizing and leveraging technology which is also available to them. Because if we think about the UK has generally been considered as the epicenter of the scam epidemic. The reasons for this is because people in the UK were generally high adopters of digital products, typically big users of social media platforms. English was there as a universal language, but also the maturity of our payments ecosystem to allow that ability for instantaneous payments from a payer to a payee. And I think just maybe adding a few more data points to that, I think it's over 95% of households in the UK have access to the internet. And I think it's even higher. I think it's about 96, 97% of the population are mobile phone users. That means the attack surface or the opportunity for these businesses is actually bigger than it's ever been before in human history. Because if we use the Oasis ticketing example, criminals knew the demand for those tickets would far outweigh 10, 15x the actual tickets that were actually available for that particular concert. So using technology allows them to basically flood social media platforms with advertisements for tickets which frankly just do not exist, but preying on the fact that customers, myself included, may have missed out on tickets and therefore might be enticed into establishing that communication with a criminal, and the criminals using automated bots to actually drive those communications in real time. So they're not just reliant on people anymore. They can use the technology just as we're using the technology. And that really is the challenge of them operating as a business. They have become significantly more organized. This is now nation state actors, organized criminals, cyber terrorists, and even insiders. And it's that advance in technology which presents that really significant challenge, given that attacks can now occur with greater speed, greater frequency, and greater effectiveness. And they're also cutting their economic costs to actually deliver these campaigns in the first place. And that really is a challenge that not just the banking sector is up against, because this isn't just a banking sector problem for the points I just kind of alluded to. This will always be a cross-sectoral problem. It can only be addressed through cross-sectoral focus.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the same from our own research at Transform Finance. That's what we've also been concluding as well. So for sure. Just leading on maybe to touch on regulatory regimes. Perhaps you could give us your thoughts about regulatory regimes and the impact that this has as well within the fraud space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from a fraud perspective in particular, we've seen a much higher rate of legislative and regulatory change and scrutiny over the past few years. Transparently, this is welcome. We know there are certain elements we will not be able to enable without the support of our regulatory partners, but also setting really clear and consistent standards is a fantastic way to ensure that fundamentally customers are provided with those same standards. So at the highest level, I think it's a really, really positive thing. I think if we think about some of the changes which have happened over the past couple of years and maybe looking a little bit ahead to the horizon, back just about this time last year, we saw the introduction of the new APP fraud rules by the PSR. I think there's been some real positives of that piece of regulation in terms of giving customers real consistency in terms of outcomes where they have been affected by fraud. I think we've seen a lot of investment in terms of the inbound fraud issue. So we know with authorized push payment fraud, it's one side of a two-sided coin, right? Fraud happens, it has to go somewhere. So that incentivization to make sure that actually we're thinking about both of these problems, I think is a really, really powerful one. But there have been some challenges, which are always expected with this kind of change. But I'm hopeful that as an industry, we will focus on how, and with our regulatory partners, focus on how we can make this even better. Because if we think about the scope of the authorized push payment fraud rules, there are a number of elements of that which aren't in scope. So, for example, international payments, for example, cryptocurrency platforms which are made off platform. We know what criminals are like. They are creatures of opportunity and sniffing out that opportunity. So if they believe there are perceived weaknesses in a framework, they will absolutely target that. And if you look at the UK Finance Annual Fraud Report, you can see quite clearly that displacement between a faster payment channel to different channels, whether that be international payments, whether that be card-based payments. Criminals are starting to pivot to flows and channels which they perceive to be potentially not as robust as the faster payment rail. But we've also seen with the failure to prevent fraud offence, which came in just under a month ago, real good focus around actually making sure that corporate organisations are responsible for ensuring that their organisations have proportionate and reasonable fraud prevention controls in place. And the last point I'll probably mention is We know this is a big part of the FCA strategy, which is fantastic in terms of really reducing APP fraud over the next 5-year arc. But we also know the UK government is focused on its own national fraud strategy, which we hope will land hopefully before the end of this year. That's really important because we have seen a previous version of a national fraud strategy. What we really want with this one is for it to be really focused on tangible outcomes. So what can that national fraud strategy really drive to make the UK a less attractive place for this kind of criminality to occur? I mentioned right at the top about the fact that around 70% of this happens, or it's estimated to happen overseas. So with that being true and solid, how do we make sure that any strategy brings into its loop that international element to it? So yeah, there's a lot of focus, a lot of attention, but I think it's positive. I think the only missing part is how we start to really pivot all of that back around to prevention and also deterrent in terms of the UK.
Exactly. Okay. Now that makes sense. That when you mentioned fast forwarding 5 years, you mentioned the UK National Fraud Strategy hopefully comes into being later this year. And what needs to change to get us into a more positive situation. So in terms of, you mentioned tangible outcomes, what do you think those factors are aside? I think we discussed previously around education and stigma associated with fraud. I mean, are there other particular areas that you could, touch on there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a short play here, and I think there's a long play. I'll start with a long play because you've mentioned it, is education. We know that in the UK, there's always, stigma might be a bit too strong, but we know that people are not typically very comfortable in speaking about their finances, or their financial lives. Whereas if you go to potentially other countries and regions, America's a very, very good example. They are very open to speaking about their financial lives, their financial well-being, and any financial issues they might have. Fraud for me is a component of that. And the only way we really kind of start to turn the tide in terms of behaviors, in terms of confidence to say no if you feel like you're being potentially pressured into doing something with your money, is to start in schools. Because when you start in schools, that behavior becomes community behavior. It becomes long-lasting behavior, which will take you through your infants, into your teens, into your adult lives. We speak an awful lot to adults today around fraud education awareness. We've desensitized people. People aren't comfortable speaking about it. It is a very, very difficult conversation to broach. So actually starting that out in schools as part of a wider package of financial literacy programs, I think will be really powerful to both break the stigma, but also to encourage people to speak about their financial health and well-being, of which this is a component. I think the shorter play is something that I and a lot of people have been a broken record on for a number of years, which is data sharing. There's a reason this was part of the measures which were outlined by the PSR a couple of years ago, because the real key to reducing fraud is that prevention. And I think we can now look with a couple of years of hindsight at, let's say, for example, the fantastic work they're doing in Australia in terms of actually really focusing on data sharing in real time at the point of transaction to reduce the inherent rate of fraud which is happening in that particular locality. We have a massive opportunity here in the UK to do the same. And what's really encouraging is actually those conversations feel more real and tangible now than they did a couple of years ago, both from a regulatory perspective, but also industry getting on with it, and industry finding ways to make sure that they can do this both within the industry, but also with other groups to actually think about that cross-sectoral relationship in terms of data sharing. Because when we think about data, there is such a wealth of data that's held by financial services, the telcos, the online platforms, that actually the opportunity there to share that data is absolutely massive. But on the flip side of that, it's also a sweet shop worth of data. So it's making sure we take the right steps to do that responsibly in a way which is really pertinent to fraud detection and fraud prevention.
Absolutely, and that also reinforces very much so at the event, obviously in London, where several of the topics there which we're focusing on those particular areas, that comes up time and time again. So that's really some positives there to take, obviously, and some really good advice there as well as to how you see things sort of moving forward in the next few years. It's interesting you mentioned Australia as well. Are there any other examples like internationally that you'd sort of highlight as well as sort of not leaders but positive, showing positive outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in Singapore they've taken some really robust steps in terms of really cracking down on misuse and exploitation. But even closer to home, like if we look over the water at the EU and our friends over there, they're currently working towards PSD3. And a big part of PSD3 is authorized push payment fraud. And they are very much starting to index in on actually how do you think about that kind of cross-sectoral responsibility for the prevention of fraud, and setting up some kind of potential liability scheme to make that happen and incentivize firms to come to the table. Now, they're still very, not early, but they're still in deep conversations around all of this. So what the outcome of that will be, we'll have to wait and see. But I'm sure they're doing what I would be doing in their situation, which is looking at the UK and saying, the UK have done a fantastic job in terms of making innocent victims of APP fraud whole. They've really gone hard on the reimbursement. Looking over to Australia and the fact they've gone hard on prevention first in front running reimbursement, and I'm sure they'll want to kind of find the best of both regimes. And I hope from a UK perspective, we'll just continue to evolve our approach to make sure that now we've done the right thing to make sure customers are reimbursed and made whole. How do we make sure they don't actually see fraud in the first place? Because this is the key, right? Just through reimbursement, that does not stop fraud from happening. That does not stop people from feeling disproportionately affected by these crimes, and it doesn't stop money getting into the hands of criminals.
Absolutely. So again, very sage words of advice there. And just going on from that, we mentioned education earlier and the younger generation. I just wanted to finish off, Richard, just by asking you, what words of advice do you have for the younger generation, for those thinking of entering, let's say, the fraud space where you're obviously active and you've had a lot of experience? What words of advice would you give to them?
Oh, good question. Firstly, do it. Like, it's a challenging space, but it's a fantastic space where you do really feel like you can make a difference every day. My 2 bits of advice would probably be, you'll create a network of peers, whether that be within your organization or via LinkedIn. I think I found massive value through mentorships during my career, and actually getting guidance from people who are probably lived and breathed what I'm currently going through. I definitely recommend doing that. But I'd also recommend embracing technology. We know that technology and AI can sometimes be seen as being a little bit scary, but actually, when we think about fraud and financial crime, it can be a real force multiplier in terms of being really confident with data, in terms of really utilizing and understanding how to apply and adopt AI in your day-to-day roles. That's the future of where we're going to go, which is very, very exciting. So I'd probably say a combination of those 2 points would be my advice.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And for those listening, I'm sure that's, again, more sage advice. So thank you very much. Was there anything else you'd like to add at all, or is there anything else? Any final comments or?
Probably final comment is I might have been a bit doom and gloom. I hope I haven't been.
No, not at all.
I just want to be, I think, being transparent around the fact that we do collectively have a challenge in front of us, but actually that's a really exciting opportunity for us with tangible output on the other end. So yes, stick out.
Absolutely. No, that all came across and all the positives. So thank you so much. Thank you for your time today.
You're very welcome.